Hello, my name is Glenn Morrow, and this is early April 2020. Um, if you're watching this now, you will understand that we are under a lockdown in most parts of the country with corona issues. Hopefully, if you're watching this in the future, hopefully things are back to normal, whatever normal is. We did learn some valuable lessons in this experience. We've been asked to try to upload some Pathfinder honors to the website that we can teach virtually. And so I thought about this sermon. I actually have a sermon where I teach an honor. It's called the Peacemaker honor. And I've done this about at least 5, if not maybe 6 times. And maybe it's run its course. And so maybe it's time to exhaust it and upload it to the internet for you all to enjoy it and benefit. There should be a way to download a worksheet that you can work on this honor as a sermon. It's kind of a different sermon, but it's a different kind of honor too. So hopefully you find benefit of this. I've taught this honor in, like I said, in 5 different sermons, maybe 6, and I've had several people tell me that they really enjoyed it, not just the Pathfinders. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to walk you through my sermon, and if you have any questions at all, you can email me. My email is on the slides, Gmail. It's a GMORROWPE at gmail.com. But I think the NAD Pathfinders is planning to upload this somehow, and hopefully there'll be a way you can download the worksheet. So if you can't get it that way, you're welcome to email me. And I'm going to turn the PowerPoint on. And this may be the last time you see my face. The rest of it is pretty intensive with PowerPoint. So hopefully you enjoy it and get a blessing out of it. So let me make sure share my screen. So I'm going to turn this on. And this takes a little while. Okay, here we go. So this is a Pathfinder honor. If you're not familiar with the Pathfinder program, Pathfinders, I explain, it's like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. The target age group is 5th grade to, ages 10 to 15 kind of thing. And it's like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, only Pathfinders is so much more. We have a spiritual aspect of this. So Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts discuss things like camping and nature honors, and we have all those too. And when they show proficiency in a certain area, they get a little patch that they call a badge. We call them honors. That's our situation. So Pathfinders is unlike those other scouting groups in the fact that we have a big spiritual component to our honors. In fact, we have whole spiritual categories that Pathfinders can learn. So if you download the worksheet and you go through this and look at it, I will tell you that you too can obtain your honor. And if you contact your local Pathfinder Club and show them that you went through this, I'm sure for a donation they'd be more than happy to buy you a patch and provide a patch to you. So, like I said, I've presented this sermon at least 5, maybe 6 times, and there have been people that have afterwards come up to me immediately afterwards and said that it was good for them to go through the exercise, even though they were not Pathfinders. It's good for all ages. And then afterwards, I had some people tell me that they started some programs in their family to learn about the Peacemaker process. So it's I know it's helped at least a few people, and I pray it's a blessing for you also. So here we go. For some reason it didn't like that. Let me try this again. And I'm not sure why. Oh, because I need to start at the beginning. That's why. Apologize for that. All right. So make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy, Hebrews 12:14. So that's the verse I typically use when I give the sermon. So I just described the honor. This was originally developed in 2009, skill level 1. So even old guys like me can understand and work our way through it. But it really is a good process to learn. Okay, conflict. If I were to ask you to define conflict, what would you say? So This isn't an auditorium, so most people tend to offer suggestions like these that you see here. It's a fight, a battle, a struggle, especially a prolonged struggle, a strife, conflict. Um, we talk about the Vietnam conflict. Some of our wars, we try to make them sound pretty by calling them conflicts, not wars. But it is a fight where people get killed. Sometimes it doesn't mean you have to get killed, but that is an aspect. Could be a controversy, a quarrel, conflicts among parties, conflicts, um, discord of action, feeling or effect, antagonism, opposition as of interest or principles. In other words, a conflict of ideas. So some things you want to do this, but yet you have some other objectives, and the two conflict. A striking together collision. So when I go out driving on the road, I try to avoid conflicts with other cars. Incompatibility or interference as one idea, desire, event, or activity with another, a conflict in schedule. So if you call me and you say you'd like to meet Wednesday at 3 o'clock, I would check my schedule and see if there's incompatibility with my schedule. If there is, I would say I have a conflict. And then psychiatric issues. A lot of people, unfortunately, in the sinful world, we have people that we say they have internal conflicts, and they're demons inside their head and just a struggle, and they're having a tough time coping. So there is the psychiatric. So these are what I call the cheap dictionaries, because this is what most people would define, and again, it's the cheap dictionaries. But what I want to illustrate to you that there are indeed two kinds of conflict, and we don't realize that typically, but there's bad conflict versus good conflict. And so this sermon is to discuss ways to recognize when we're in bad conflict and why we need to go to good conflict. Okay? So let's start filling out our worksheets. Bad conflict is called catabolic conflict. Yeah, catabolic conflict is the bad conflict. So catabolic it's a biology term. It talks about a destructive metabolism. It's basically where things break down. So you have something good. Let's say you have muscle, and if you have catabolic conflict, something attacks it, it depletes it, and it breaks it down to nothing. So cells sometimes will go through catabolic changes where it goes from something complex down to something simple. And then the anabolic conflict is the good conflict. And this is what we don't typically think of as conflict, but it is a very important conflict, and we need to strive to have good conflict. So anabolic. So if you think about steroids, we talk about anabolic steroids. You're building your muscles up. Anabolic steroids may not necessarily be something good, but that's the idea behind the word. It's building them up. So the idea is we need to make sure that we have anabolic conflict. So I'm going to caution you over the next few slide frames. They have a political slant to them. And I want to make sure that everyone understands before I get into this that I am a firm believer that the pulpit should not be used to tell people how to vote. I don't want to make you feel good or bad because you vote for or against a certain party. So there's some political slides, but I'm not at all implying one side or the other. I use them because it's a current example. The Bible is really nice, but people sometimes say, it's been at least 2,000 years ago. It doesn't really apply anymore. I want to illustrate that there's some examples that we can pull from today to learn. So they're in the news all the time, and I apologize for this, but I think it's a really good way to illustrate what we're trying to talk about. Okay. Does anybody remember this? So this is during the last presidential election. And I think you all recognize this. Would this be considered anabolic or catabolic conflict? I think most everybody, the entire country, would agree it was catabolic conflict. We had two parties that would discuss, and I say that term nicely, during debates, various things, but they really couldn't say anything nice about each other. They would tear each other down. They definitely were not building each other up. Probably my favorite question during the debates, they asked both candidates, can you say something nice about your opponent? And both candidates really struggled with that question. I think the American voters did too. Wanted to illustrate that for some reason society seems to be getting worse and worse and worse as far as this area goes. In the old days, and I say before this election anyway, you look back through history and people would vote for, well, you've always had people who vote for their party. So there's the Republicans, there's the Democrats. Some commentators might call them the monkey voters. Basically, it wouldn't matter if their party had a monkey as a candidate, they would vote for them because they always vote Republican, they always vote Democrat, or vice versa. And so you've always had that 25-30% for each party. There doesn't matter who they put up there as their candidate, they would vote for them because that's their party, that's their team. And then the people in the middle would look at both candidates, the other half of the American public, and would say, well, I like this candidate A, but I think I like candidate B better. So when you look back through time, whether it was Obama, Mitt Romney, or whoever, as you go on back in time, it's not that most people thought Mitt Romney was a bad guy, and I'm not just talking about Mitt, but all the previous failed candidates. But they just happen to think that Obama or whoever they were running, or whoever the winning candidate was a better person. So they did that. In this election, a commentator afterwards was talking about how the polls were showing that each candidate had a more than a 50% disapproval rating. Most of the people disliked both candidates. It was amazing. So when at least the person that I saw was trying to explain it, said that when we went to the polls, we didn't like this candidate, but we really, really didn't like that candidate. So what his opinion is that more people really, really, really disliked Hillary Clinton than they really, really liked or disliked Donald Trump. So, and again, I'm not trying to talk about how you voted. I really don't care. But I just wanted you to know that that's getting differently. Hopefully it's changed, but the way it's shaping up, at least in April of 2020, I'm not so sure that's going to be the case this time either. Unfortunately. So it seems to be getting more divisive. We're more team. It's my team. I vote for my team, if you will. And if the other team says it, I'm against it. If my team says it, I'm for it. And that's really not a good way to deal with our conflicts. The next picture. So again, I'm not trying to make any political statements here. This is the president's cabinet, and granted, probably a lot of those faces have been gone since I stole this picture off the internet. So again, I'm not trying to make a political statement here, but is the cabinet, is that anabolic or catabolic conflict? Or is it anything? So the answer, you would hope, and of course I don't know because I don't sit in on the cabinet meetings, but I would hope that it's anabolic conflict. I hope that they're challenging each other, building each other up. I do hope that there's conflict, regardless of who the president is, whether I like him or dislike him or her, I should say. We should really hope that there is conflict in those internal meetings. Because what you don't want to see happen is what happened in this picture. If you recognize this picture, this was John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, we tend to think of as one of the best presidents ever. If you ask people on their favorite presidents or the best presidents, he would be the Mount Rushmore presidents if we were to redo Mount Rushmore today. He wished us to the moon, and he did a lot of good things for civil rights, and we appreciate all those things. But we tend to forget right before he died, his approval ratings were low. In fact, his approval ratings were so low. I'm not sure when they started keeping them, but they weren't equaled until the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky issue, which, if you think about in the lifetime of politics, it's an extreme amount of time. The reason why, if you know what, just Google some things like Bay of Pigs, where we tried to attack Cuba. The Vietnam War, he really got us into the Vietnam War. And I don't want to go into it, but his approval ratings were so low. That's why he was in Dallas the day he was. That's why he was in campaign mode, full-blown campaign mode. He really thought he was going to lose the next election. And I like to read history books, and Secret Service claims that they really begged him to not ride in a convertible car or even do the trip at all. But he was focused on campaigning because his approval ratings were so bad. Now, to be fair, every president since Clinton may have made that disapproval rating go higher and higher. We'll see. But the point is that anabolic conflict is much better than no conflict, because what people don't really, at least the historians I've read, don't really blame John F. Kennedy for his failures. They blame these people you see sitting around the table, because there was no conflict in this cabinet. He had guys who were what we might call yes men. Oh yes, Mr. President, that's a great idea, Mr. President. Instead of really challenging the president and trying to make him really think if that was indeed something that was really a smart idea, are you sure you want to do that? They just said, yes, sir. Yes, Mr. President. We'll make that happen, Mr. President. And so when you're not being challenged, it leads to a lot of bad decisions. So the point is anabolic conflict, catabolic conflict, and no conflict. Catabolic conflict, we all understand, is the worst. Anabolic conflict doesn't sound like a good thing because it's conflict, but it is way better than no conflict at all. So that's enough of the politics and modern. We're going to jump into Bible times. So the honor asks us to go through the Bible. It actually brings out some stories we need to talk about first, and then we jump into some other places in the Bible. So first place that the honor wants us to talk about is Acts 15, 1 through 20. Now, I'm not going to read all these verses. If you want to pause the video or go back after the video and watch them, and read them, you're more than welcome to. But in Acts 15, we're just going to talk about these stories. Probably most of you know these stories probably better than I do. So this is what we call the conflict over circumcision, or what most people call the Jerusalem Council. So you had Peter on one side, Paul on the other. You had some really hardcore Christians, Jewish Christians, I should say. And you had some more, I want to say maybe liberal, or at least maybe newer Christians and the Gentiles. And so the Jewish Christians were concerned because the Gentile Christians weren't Jewish enough in their Christianism. And so the question is how was this story illustrate catabolic conflict? So if you read the story, they're arguing about circumcision, and basically they're arguing about it, and it's not to draw everybody together. It's to really split people apart. Was their intent? They really wanted to clean up the Gentile Christians, if you will. They wanted to drive it apart, and they were this argument was splitting the groups apart, which is not a good thing. But then, how does it illustrate anabolic conflict? So, verse 6, they actually met to consider the question. They got representatives from this side, representatives from the other side. They got together and said, "Hey, let's talk about it." They prayed about it, and they says that they brought the discussion up to God, and they came up with a compromise. What is really important here, and they did a compromise. So that's where this story talks about catabolic conflict in the beginning and anabolic conflict at the end. The next story the honor wants us to talk about is 1 Corinthians 12. This is where parts of the body, it says, we are all parts of the Bible, or I'm sorry, parts of the church. It talks about the unity, where this part of the body can't act like it's the mouth, and what happens if this part wants to protest and so forth. I have to confess to you, I've always disliked this story. I shouldn't say always, but for a long time I've disliked it. And the reason why is because I've known some people that knew a guy who would say, he told the pastor once upon a time that he was there to do handiwork around the church, but don't ask him to do anything else. That was his role. And I don't want to diminish the roles, people do that fix up the church, our building, and do all those kinds of things. But there are some people that believe that their job is one thing and one thing only. And I truly believe that God wants us to grow. And I understand Paul, what he was trying to say here is that, we can't all be the preacher. We can't all be this. But my goodness, let's try to grow our relationship. And I have another sermon actually teaches the beekeeping honor. And I say if Paul was actually a beekeeper, he would say we should be like a beehive, where we all do all the jobs, but we all grow in our duties. So um, that's the story here. So the question is, how does these verses, this story, how does it discuss catabolic conflict, and how does it discuss anabolic conflict? So the catabolic conflict, some parts of the body don't want to belong, so they're throwing a fit. They want to, they think that they're superior than other parts, or other parts think that it's not fair that they're doing jobs beneath them. So that's definitely catabolic conflict, and I can imagine. I know this happens in your church because we're full of people, and all churches have the differences of opinions. And as much as we try to get along, some of this stuff does come up. It happens in every church. It's not just yours. So that's the catabolic conflict. So the anabolic conflict, Paul suggests to us that we can encourage, rejoice, and support each other. That's how we turn that catabolic conflict into anabolic conflict. I love Pathfinder ministry. Other people may have a mission and something in their heart to do something with homeless. Other people have something, pass out tracts or whatever. I've been in some church board meetings where people get upset, because they have a ministry and they need some help in the ministry, and nobody else is helping them. I guess you could be upset, but they want other people to stop their ministries and help them with their ministry. And we have to learn to work together. We should applaud each other. I'm glad that you have something in your heart to do something, but you know what? My heart is in Pathfinders, and vice versa. I shouldn't insist that you quit doing your ministry and come help me in Pathfinders just because that's what I have in my heart. So we should encourage each other. I shouldn't be upset that your ministry is blossoming and maybe my ministry is struggling. I should applaud you. I should help you however I can if I have that in my heart. So this is the anabolic conflict. We should encourage each other. We should pray for each other. We should applaud each other. We should help them out, and vice versa. They should appreciate what we have in our heart and what God has put on our heart for us to do. So the honor also, this is the last story it asks us to really talk about, but in Genesis 13, 1 through 12, this is the story of Abraham and Lot. So Abraham and Lot, if you don't recall the story, they basically were both sheep herders, and their groups got too big and they didn't have enough land to feed all the sheep. So Lot basically went up and he says, hey, Abraham went up and said to Lot, he goes, look to the left, look to the right, you pick one side, I'll take the other side. Well, you get first shot kind of thing. So how did this story discuss catabolic conflict, and how did they turn into anabolic conflict? Catabolic conflict was when they started, they were too close together. They were concerned about their own flocks, and it was a competitive nature, it says their sheep herds were arguing, and so because the land couldn't support everything, so they were trying to do too much on the land that they had to work with. So the anabolic side, as I just described, Abraham, in his wisdom, said, "Look, we need to split up. Tell you what, I don't care. You pick one side, I'll pick the other side." And so Lot picked the lush green area, and in retrospect, that had Sodom and Gomorrah in it. So you know how that story wound up. But to solve this issue, Abraham did the right thing. He said, "Look, we need to split up. You can pick the first spot, and I'll take whatever's left over." So that was the kind of compromise that they did there. In James 4, 1 through 3, I'm going to read this verse, these verses. It says, what do these verses say about anabolic conflict? So it says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something but don't get it. You kill and you covet, but you cannot have what you want. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. So in essence, what it's saying is you desire because of your selfish motives. So when we find ourselves in catabolic conflict, that's, we're fighting all those issues they talked about. Those are catabolic issues. When you find yourself in a catabolic issue, it's because you have selfish desires. We need to look at ourselves and say, what am I doing that maybe I could turn this into an anabolic conflict. So the honor focuses on something that I want to highly recommend. There's a book called The Peacemaker. It's by Ken Sande, I think is how he pronounces his name. You can get online and you can actually view the first chapter of this, and it's a very good chapter. I didn't buy the book. I'll buy a different book that I'll describe to you in a little bit. But this book, it goes through what we call the slippery slope. So the slippery slope is, if you were to imagine, remember when you're a kid and you want to play King of the Mountain? That's the idea. You want to be on top of the slope. When you start getting off of the center, you can start falling down on either side. And it's very, very hard to pull yourself back up. And so the idea is we have to realize when we're starting to slide down the slope, we need to recognize it and we need to get ourselves back to the middle. So if you look at how this is written out, and you can fill in your worksheet as we go along here, but if you notice that there are 3 categories that slippery slope is split up. 2 of them are catabolic. On the left and the right are catabolic, and the one in the middle is anabolic. So the escape responses, which is on the far left side, these are things like suicide, flight, and denial. Again, the escape responses are suicide, flight, and denial. And the attack responses, which is on the other side, are the assault, litigation, and murder. Again, assault, litigation, and murder. So the peacemaking responses are what I call the anabolic responses, and those are in the middle. So I'm going to list those. It's called overlook, if you can't read it. Overlook, reconciliation, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and accountability. So obviously, if you're in situations where you're looking at suicide, flight, or denial, murder, litigation, or assault, you want to try to move yourself back up the slippery slope to overlook, reconciliation, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and accountability. Those are much better responses on how we deal with crisis in our lives than the catabolic responses. So the trends, it's important to notice the trends too. So when you look at the trends, if you look from the left to the right, it goes from private to public. So I'm going to backtrack here. So if you notice, the extreme are suicide and murder. Suicide is something that I would do to myself. Murder is something I'm going to do to you. So it's going from me to you, and it's something I do in private to something I do in public. They also go from voluntary to forced. So if you look at the chart here, flight is, you're free to go. It's something you make on your own. It's voluntary. But if you look on the opposite spectrum, the litigation, that's something I'm doing to you. I'm forcing you to do something. So it goes from voluntary to force as we move from left to right. The next trend that we want to talk about is defensive to antagonistic. Defensive to antagonistic. So defensive is more the denial phase. Like, no. Defensive, you're denying that you did it. Someone's accusing you and you deny it, or maybe you're accusing yourself and you deny it. The opposite counterpart to that is assault. That is something where I'm going after you. So again, this is antagonistic. I'm going after you. So it goes from defensive to antagonistic. The extreme responses is the greatest loss. The extreme responses is the greater loss. So again, suicide and murder are loss of life. That's something, I would prefer denial and assault than if we were to slide on that even further to suicide and murder. The end focus is on me to you. So you look at, me is the escape, and you is the attack kinds of responses. And the middle focus, of course, is on us. So it's not focused on me, it's not focused on you, it's focused on us. How can we figure this out together? And that's where we really need to be. Okay? So I did not buy that book. What I did buy was this book. It's called The Young Peacemaker. It's by Mr. Sandy's wife. Name's Corlette Sandy. And she, I don't want to say dumbed it down, but she made it more kid friendly. So instead of suicide and murder, the extreme are run away and fight. So we're going to spend the rest of the time going through the Bible looking for stories that fit each of these categories. There are 3,237 people in the Bible, listed in the Bible. And I'm sure that's right because it's listed on the internet and everything you find on the internet is true, correct? Or something like that. But that's a lot of people. And you know what? Out of those 3,237 people in the Bible, only one of them was perfect. And even that one perfect person had conflict in their lives. So the nice thing about the Bible is, even though it happened 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6,000 years ago, there are examples in there that we can glean from their stories, and we can look and see how they did it. Sometimes they're good examples, sometimes they're bad examples. Everybody can be an example, and people in the Bible are no different. They're good examples, bad examples, and it's good for us to think about their stories and learn from them how we should or we should not respond when it comes time for what we do. So I'm going to read through them. You don't have to write these down because they're listed in your handout, but the escape or runaway, blame and deny, the attack or fight, gossip, put downs, and the work it out or overlook, talk, and get help. So I'm going to tell you this is not school. So the honor asks us to go through each category and to think about a story in the Bible where this was involved. And so again, this is not school, so you're welcome to copy off of me. I'm going to tell you what I wrote down, okay? I would challenge you, if you want extra credit, some attaboys or attagirls, think of stories that aren't the ones that I mentioned, or maybe at least think about it ahead of time. Maybe if you want to pause it and put your stories down that way, you came up with them without my help. But I'm going to tell you what I wrote down for each one, and we're going to walk through the stories and talk about how that happened. The second part of each question is to give a personal example. Now, this one you can't copy off of me. Even though I can't see you on this internet virtual platform that we're on right now, I can tell that none of you are me. So I'm going to give you some examples from my personal life, and you have to think of some examples from your own personal life and to complete the honor, okay? So it's one thing to think about when other people in the Bible experience these situations, but we need to think about either ourselves or somebody we know was involved in these situations, and maybe later we can think about how could we have done that better, okay? So let's get started. The first category are the escape categories. So escape, this is where you're more interested in avoiding an issue than in solving it, okay? So the first escape mechanism is denial. So the story I thought of that I'm going to present to you is in 1 Samuel 2:22. And again, we're not going to look these verses up. You can write the text down if you want to go back and read the story and find out more about them. But this is where Eli was a high priest. His kids were doing some things that they shouldn't have been doing. And Eli knew about it. And shame on him. He did not address it like he should have. He should have put a stop to it, but his kids weren't acting right, and it's really his fault because he had the power to stop it and he didn't. So this is an example where you can and things did not turn out well for him. You can read the story and see how that all turned out. But my personal example that I'm going to offer to you, I have employees at work, and I have had employees for a while, and I can tell you that every time I know an employee is doing something that they shouldn't be, and I don't address it, they rarely, if ever, do they ever get better on their own. It's not till I actually say, okay, we have a problem. I call the employee in, we talk about it, and try to help to fix the situation. Because if I ignore the problem, if I deny it, it never gets better on its own. Okay, so So you see how this works? We're going to talk about a Bible story, and then we're going to talk about personal issue. Okay, the escape, called the blame game. So here's a story you can find in Genesis 3:11 through 13. My version of the Bible said something like, God was mad at Adam for playing football, and Adam says, that's the football right there. It's my version of the Bible. Maybe your version says something different. But Adam was saying, it's not my fault. It's this woman's fault. And in fact, Adam even turned around and goes, God, it's your fault because you put her here for me. So there's a lot of blame game. Don't blame me, blame her, blame you. And so this is a blame game. And obviously that did not turn out very well either. That's definitely a catabolic response on how we deal with conflict. And how should he have done it? He should have maybe turned around and God said, you know what, God, you're right. Didn't, maybe would have had the same result, but I think he and God would have had a much better relationship going forward than what happened during what they did. So as far as my personal example, in college, I had to take Calculus 1 over again. And why? Because I had a bad teacher. Half the class failed and we all had to go back. That's what I said at the time, and probably said for a few years after college. But looking back, I think probably I had something to do with that issue. Whether it was for whatever reason I wasn't ready, I didn't study hard enough, I didn't apply myself like I could have. I definitely didn't apply myself like I should have. So I had to retake calculus. It's probably a good thing because I actually learned it the second time. But that was an example of my personal life where for a few years I said, well, it wasn't my fault. Everybody in the class, had that kind of issue. So not everybody, because a lot of people did pass it just fine. I really was playing the blame game. All right, escape, runaway. We're going to talk about runaway. Story I thought of was in Jonah 1:3. So he was told to go to Nineveh. He decided to go to Tarshish. He basically went the wrong way. And you can read how that story turned out for Jonah. My personal example, I had my favorite job ever, and I left it because I didn't like dealing with a coworker. Some of you may have heard the story that I've discussed a few times, but I had a much better opportunity to leave later, and I didn't leave when I did. But for the most part, yeah, I left because I didn't like dealing with a coworker. I ran away from a job that I loved. So crazy. Why did I do that? But I did. So shame on me. All right. So we're going to talk about the other extreme, the attack category. This is where you are more interested in winning than saving the relationship. So I'm going to attack you. I don't care about us. I'm going to do what I can to conquer you. So there are attack put downs. The example I thought of was in Nehemiah. So Nehemiah 4 is where I see this story. The guy named Sanballat, he was talking about, ooh, you feeble Jews, they can't finish, those stones are dead. So to be honest, when I look back at this, that's really pretty tame. But you have to remember, this is days before Facebook and Instagram and all those other internet options that we have now to put people down, where I think the humans have really perfected the form of the put downs. But back in the day, this is big stuff. You were challenging people's manhoods, about being able to build a wall. And the cool thing is Nehemiah's response to this. Nehemiah could have, traded punch for punch, and if they would have done that, it would have taken them a long time to finish that wall. But Nehemiah told his guys, he says, look, just ignore them, be ready in case they attack, but let's build the wall. And so instead of, building the wall in a year, it took them like 52 days or something like that, I think is what I recall. So the fact that Nehemiah responded in the grown-up attitude in response to the attack put down, says a lot about Nehemiah. Very good for Nehemiah. As far as my personal, I remember some people I knew in high school, and it didn't seem to matter what anybody said about anybody else. They always had a put down to add to it. It's just their automatic response. I don't know if you know people like that, especially in high school for whatever reason. Those people thrive there. It's like their only way to communicate. They just have the put down response. You could say, "Hey, nice shoes," and they would have something really nasty to say about it. Um, whether the original person intended to say something bad or not. It's just they always had a put down. And just they're not very fun to be around. I don't know what happened to those folks after high school, but at least I knew some people like that. Maybe you have too. That's who I thought of when I came across this one. The next category in attack is gossiping. So the numbers the story I think of is in Numbers 13. This is where they sent the spies over to the promised land to figure out what was going on. They came back, and the Bible says that the rest of the group spread fear by gossiping. About we can't take them, and this is where God just flat out lost it. And he goes, "Fine, you're stuck in the wilderness for 40 years. You really you won't have faith in me. Yeah, there are big people over there, but you can conquer them because I'm God. I'm bigger than they are," and so forth. So that's gossiping, a time in the Bible where they were accused of gossiping. And for my personal story, there's a time where somebody hurt me pretty bad, and it was factual. But I tell you, I told a lot of people. I don't know if I thought it was therapy or what, but I told a lot of people what this person did to me. And it wasn't until a few years later I learned and at least realized that, just because it was factual doesn't mean it still wasn't gossip, and that wasn't right. It's you can handle the other issue, but then I made things worse because I told people it really had no business knowing all the details of what this other person did to me. So I participate in gossip. I'm not proud of that, but that's something I did in my life, and I wish maybe I hadn't have. And I try not to do it again. So even when things are truthful, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not being gossipy. Obviously, you don't want to spread false witnesses either, but that's another form of gossip we generally think about. But I do encourage you to think about gossiping, even when you're telling the truth. It's not necessarily a good thing. So another attack category is the fight. And of course, I think about the very first murder that happened in the Bible, Cain and Abel, Genesis 4. This is a nice one to look at in the Bible. I would encourage you because I really like God's response in this. And he's God's talking to Cain, and of course God knows that Cain's not telling the truth about where his brother is, but he says, "If you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, and you must rule over it." So he's telling Cain, you have to take responsibility for your own actions. Even if, when you build up to it, if you're not doing what's right, sin is right there and it's ready to pounce on you, and you're going to do things you're going to regret. And you must rule over it. God's telling Cain, you have to take responsibility for your actions. So, my personal example, I'm going to say 5th grade, and that's all I'm going to say about that. So you can use your own imagination what may have happened to me in 5th grade. All right. So work it out. Work it out. This is the best place to be on the slippery slope. You want to be on top. Work it out solutions are commanded by God. They're empowered by the gospel, and they basically are directed so that both of us can succeed, or at least have agreeable solutions. I'll say it that way. It doesn't necessarily mean that I win and you lose. It basically means hopefully we both win a little, and in most cases it can mean that you both win a lot. So work it out is what we should strive to handle all of our conflict about. So the next example, so as far as the work it out, is the overlook. So I think of John 8. So there was a lady who was doing some things that she wasn't necessarily proud of, and there's lots of people standing around her, accusing her. Jesus took care of the accusers, and then he dealt with the lady in what I call the overlook response. So people always ask, we don't know what Jesus would say if he came down today and, met somebody with whatever the sin du jour is, he would forgive and everything. Well, I don't think so, because he demonstrated several times how he dealt with sinners. He never dismissed the sin. He forgave the sin. And then once he would forgive the sin, he would say, go and sin no more. He didn't say it's okay that you're sinning. You can keep sinning. I'm going to forgive you always. He says, tell you what, I'm going to forgive your sin, and I want you to stop sinning, please, and go your way, and please don't do that again. And that's how Jesus dealt with it. He overlooked it. He says, I know what you did, and you're forgiven. I'm going to overlook it, but go and sin no more. He challenges us to do that. So my personal example, I have kids, and when I think about kids, and if you have kids too, you know that you just have to overlook a lot of things. Kids are growing. Sometimes they say things or they do things, they don't really mean it. But when they do, you just, instead of losing your temper or, getting even or punishing, sometimes it's best just to overlook it. And, I don't want to say you deal with it later like you're ignoring it, but you overlook it and you realize that there's other things going on in their life, and you forgive them. Okay. So work it out, talk. So the story I think of is David um, and Abigail. So Abigail's husband at the time, Nabal, said some really stupid things, and David was about to say, "Fine, I want to kill Nabal and all the men, and I'm just going to really make a big mess of everything." And Abigail said, "Wait, let's go talk." So she started out, "Please forgive my stupid husband," and she did talk to them. She talked some sense into David, and um, I'm sure she did some things that was able to help David not do something stupid, because David was ready to do something stupid. He was so mad. So, um, my personal example about talking it out, how I respond to my wife. My wife and I, my love is how we talk to each other. And so my love, so whenever I'm really mad at her, it's my love, why did you? And then that alone reminds me of that, I am talking to my love. And so we can talk about it. It settles me down because she is my love. I don't want to lose her. I don't want to offend her. I don't want to, create hardship that in my marriage. So she is my love. So it encourages us. That's the trigger, for at least for me. And to say she is my love, and helps us to talk about it. The next category is get help. So I think of a story in 1 Kings 3 that involves Solomon. Um, some people, some ladies couldn't come to an agreement, and they were going to come have Solomon and literally cut the baby in half. Was the where that phrase comes from. You can read that story in 1 Kings 3. And so they were trying to decide how to solve it, so they went to somebody a lot smarter. So they got help from somebody who was smarter than Solomon. And as far as my personal example, I think about in both my personal and professional lives, I've had occasions to meet with what's called a mediator. And so, whether somebody's suing somebody, and so I'm representing this party, and so we have attorneys on each side of the table, and we talk about it through the attorneys, and they mediate a solution. Some people believe that mediators are, just trying to find solutions that are unappealing to both parties, equally unappealing, and maybe there's some truth in that. But if done correctly, mediators can help each party come to a solution that's better for everybody involved. Okay, so to conclude, how can you stay on top? So again, I'm going to tell you what I wrote down in Psalms 19:14. Is what I think of. It's a verse that says, "May the words of my mouth and this meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight." If you think about how Jesus dealt with conflicts, he spent a lot of time in prayer. He made sure that God was and the Holy Spirit were inside of him at all times and helped him respond to everything. And when you have your heart softened, when you see things through God's eyes, when you're asking God for guidance in everything you do, That's how you can keep from slipping down the slope towards the more drastic measures, and you can stay on top towards the middle. So again, I encourage you to think about situations in the Bible that discussed all of these areas, because every single person in the Bible dealt with conflicts. And then like I said, the only perfect guy in there, he dealt with conflicts. So we're going to deal with conflicts no matter who you are. It's unrealistic to expect to go through life without conflicts. It just happens. So how you can deal with it and stay on top, put God in your heart. And that's what I want to tell you. So the very last thing you need to do, and you have to do this on your own, find a buddy. This could be your brother, sister, could be your friend when the virus thing is over and you can get outside again. But find someone that you can reverse role play. So think about a conflict in your own life and identify where you were on the slippery slope, somewhere going down the sides. And think about how you could redo that situation by reverse role playing and work it out in the options. So let's close with prayer. Dear Lord, we talked about a lot this afternoon, and it's in conflict. And we know that conflict is in our lives because we're not in heaven yet. Once we left the Garden of Eden, we experienced conflict, and we're going to be in conflict until your return. And we can't wait for that day. But in the meantime, we ask that you work with us as situations come up, as the devil really tries to get at us. They really try to get us to slide down a slippery slope. We ask that you give us responses and opportunities, at least the wherewithal to realize where we are on the slope, and help us to look for better solutions and get back up the slope and stay on top, so we can be ready for your kingdom when you come back. We ask these things in the name. Amen. So I hope that you've enjoyed this. Go back to my ugly face here. Hope you enjoyed that sermon. If you're close to Milwaukee and Chicago area, I wouldn't be at all opposed if you want this for a sermon. This is what the sermon is. I might have to update after the next presidential election with some of the topical issues. But for the most part, this is the Peacemaker honor. And if you can complete the worksheet, show it to your club director, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to get you a patch and to show that you've accomplished the Peacemaker honor. So with that, if you have any questions, you have my email address, but God bless you and how you deal with these things.